Welcome back. Now that we've talked about how life-limiting fetal conditions are a unique subset within the perinatal loss experience, we're going to talk about a few conceptual frameworks to better help us understand what it is that parents are going through. Now, as a society, we tend to hold core beliefs concerning the pregnancy narrative. The most obvious being we expect a pregnancy to result in a healthy baby. When parents learn they are expecting, they anticipate a baby shower, putting together a nursery, they start picking out names. These are all things that are expected within a pregnancy. The core beliefs that we hold are instrumental in influencing our reproductive story. And remember, I mentioned earlier that our reproductive story does not hold perinatal loss. So this brings in what philosophers call an ontological death. An ontological death is not the death of a person, but rather the death of meaning, or what we find meaningful. And how do we define what is meaningful? We learn through our lived experiences how the world works. This is called our world understanding. So as we grow up and learn about different things through our language, our culture, our social upbringing, we learn how the world operates. Because we're talking about perinatal loss, specifically our world understanding of a pregnancy is that the pregnancy results in a healthy baby. Now, this interruption in a core belief and this ontological death that it brings about really shatters to our core our understanding of how the world works, what is meaningful, and who we are. Now remember, we already talked about the identity crisis that emerges with a life-limiting fetal condition when a parent does not transition into that state of parenthood. Because again, our world understanding is that you need a live child in order to be considered a parent. Other such things that occur from this is that we don't understand how our lived experiences fit into our reality, and that causes us to construct a new reality. So in an ontological death, like I said, the death of meaning and how the world works is a significant positive predictor of complicated grief. This type of death often accompanies great personal loss, such as the loss of wealth, a loved one, physical health, and it's really begun influencing an investigation of the illness narrative. So, as I mentioned, this death often results in the death of an identity, as the roles and practices that one held they're no longer applicable to the situation. Perinatal loss, as it results in this ontological death, is really that whole collapse of our understanding of the meaning of a pregnancy. Viewing pregnancy complicated by a life-limiting fetal condition through the lens of an ontological death then helps us understand more what it is that parents are going through. And it helps us understand that the parents are going through this identity crisis and this interrupted understanding of how the world works. I would like to note here that this model really helps us illustrate the importance of follow-up care following perinatal loss. Because these complex emotions do not resolve with the completion of the pregnancy, they continue to go about. This identity crisis does not resolve with the completion of the pregnancy. Parents continue to need ongoing support by the healthcare team. Now, the perinatal loss, as I've mentioned, is distinctly different from the loss of a parent, a spouse, a friend, or even an older child. Because perinatal loss cannot be compared to other socially understood losses, remember those social expectations of what parents should feel or should experience or how they should behave are not consistent with the reality that the parents are experiencing. Because of that, perinatal loss is really best described as a paradoxical experience. Parents' experiences don't align with social expectations. Now, contrary to previously held assumptions, prenatal attachment, like we talked about, does not diminish with the diagnosis of a life-limiting fetal condition. The parental bond continues to evolve, and parents actively parent their child in utero. Chloe shared with me, "I just wish he understood that I loved my baby as much as the next mother loved her baby. Because to the doctors, our baby don't have brains or brain function, but our babies have a heart, and they are very, very viable, and they are loved." Despite the utter heartbreak and this tragic loss that occurs, parents found meaning and joy in their experiences. Though society tends to shrink away from talking about death, especially related to perinatal loss, parents wanted so badly to talk about their loss, both during and after the completion of the pregnancy. While society expects parents' grief to resolve with the completion of the pregnancy, parents continue to grieve deeply for years after. The statement from Michael, a participant in my study that I've been talking about, speaks powerfully to the paradox of perinatal loss when he shares, "I don't think either my wife or I would say her pregnancy was without joy." The paradox of perinatal loss unfortunately further contributes to disenfranchised grief. If the evolving fetal bond following a life-limiting fetal diagnosis is not understood or acknowledged, the corresponding grief, whether anticipatory, actual, or perceived, is consequentially disenfranchised. So it's important to recognize this paradox with this life-limiting fetal diagnosis. Interacting with and conversing with parents according to socially understood expectations of the pregnancy narrative is not appropriate, and it is not consistent with the parent's needs. Recognizing our own assumptions is also important because this shapes how we interact with and talk with parents. Remember how I said in the beginning of my story, my assumptions on what I thought my sister and her husband would want directed my entire plan of action. So as I said, I've begun to challenge my assumptions and really take a deeper look at what I assume to be true, because essentially assumptions are nothing more than something we hold to be true despite any evidence. So we have no evidence to support our beliefs. Now, on that note, I want to talk about the concept of implicit bias. And I know we've been learning more about implicit bias, especially in recent years, but I still would like to touch on it. So implicit bias is our underlying and unrecognized view of a person or a situation. As we evolved as a species, it was critically important for our survival to be able to instantly decide whether a situation was dangerous or not dangerous. Because of this, our brains have evolved to categorize information instantly based on minimal input. Since I've learned about implicit bias and started challenging my own assumptions, I've noticed that as I walk down the street, I find myself categorizing different people as I see them. As I catch myself putting them into different categories, I start wondering, why? Why have I decided that this person is safe or this person is dangerous? Why have I decided this person is smart or this person is lazy? There's no reason for me to believe that that is true based on 10 seconds of observation. And that's where that implicit bias comes from. So while it's not bad, implicit bias is not a bad thing in and of itself, it's important to remember that we act on our own assumptions and we act on our own biases. And that's why we need to start taking a look at why or where our bias lies. So in light of my assumptions and implicit bias regarding a life-limiting fetal condition, I invite you too to take a humble approach as I have in looking at the perinatal loss experience and start to challenge your own assumptions. And before you act on something, ask yourself, is this consistent with reality? And that right there provides the opportunity to start meeting the needs of the parents where they are. So as a mental exercise, in your course materials, there's a worksheet on implicit bias. Go ahead and take a few minutes to fill that out. When you come back we will talk about how we can incorporate what we've learned in this module into the practice setting.